Well, good morning, friends. Thanks for joining us here this first Sunday in November. And last week in our live version of the service, we had the kids helping us with the story of Ruth, and we had a bit of drama, and it was kind of fun as they helped us with the last part of the first chapter of the book of Ruth. And that pivotal moment there when Ruth says to her mother-in-law, Naomi, "Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." That phrasing there, in a sense, always reminds me of 1 Peter 2. The passage in Ruth says that she is choosing Naomi's God and choosing her people. In 1 Peter, God says, "I am choosing you to become my people." And so that's the story of Scripture. God's initiative, God reaches out, and then our response. What will we do with the grace offered to us? God is always going ahead of us, asking, will you follow me? Will you take a hold of what I'm offering? So last week we left the story with Naomi and Ruth arriving back in the promised land just at the time of the barley harvest. And it's going to be a bumper crop because God is blessing Israel again. So let's pick up the story. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." Naomi said, "Go ahead, my daughter." And so she went out and entered a field and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. These two women are desperate. They're scavenging just to stay alive. Ruth figures, okay, just let me try this, picking up leftover grain from behind the harvesters. This wasn't an uncommon practice. It probably happened back in Moab as well. But Ruth also knew that she needed to be careful. Not every farmer would allow this practice, and she was a foreigner after all. However, amongst the Israelites, gleaning wasn't just a desperate scavenging practice. It was actually built into the covenant promises of God. God said to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, "I will be your God, you will be my people. I will bless you, and you'll be a blessing to others." That's a covenant, a promise with a two-way street. These promises and conditions of the covenant with Abraham and his children are repeated at Mount Sinai in the giving of the law with Moses. If you obey these laws, I will bless you. I'll be faithful to you if you're faithful to me. It's a covenant promise, a two-way street. Now, here is one of the specific conditions of the covenant promise that God gives in Leviticus 19. "Now, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very corners of your field, nor shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest, nor shall you glean your vineyard, nor shall you gather the fallen fruit of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the needy and for the stranger. I am the Lord your God." In Deuteronomy, the language is expanded a bit. It's not just the needy and the stranger, but more specifically, the orphan, the widow, and the foreigner. Ruth and Naomi definitely fit these categories. So there's two things here. This directive is to landowners, to farmers, to the well-off, let's say. Don't be stingy. You'll have more than enough crop for yourself, so be generous. Secondly, this is God's built-in provision for the poor and marginalized. The poor are always going to be with us. It's a reality. But God plans in advance how a society can provide for and give dignity to those who are struggling. This was God's built-in provision for Naomi and Ruth, long before Naomi ever gave a thought to God. Remember years before when Naomi and Elimelech were looking at the famine around them and making a decision to move to Moab. God was right there, waiting for them to turn their eyes towards him. I will provide if. Well, that's who God is. I am Yahweh, the personal God who cares about all your needs. I will not leave you destitute. Did Ruth know about God's covenant promise regarding gleaning? It's hard to say. We don't really know. She knew, I guess, that gleaning was possible culturally, but she knew it also depended on the farmer, the landowner's generosity, or in her case as a foreigner, if he was going to be anti-racist and anti-xenophobic as well as generous. So she goes out to glean and seemingly just picks a field randomly. But it turns out that the field belongs to one of Naomi's relatives, Boaz. After a bit, Boaz, the landowner, comes along and says to one of his workers there, who's that woman? I've never seen her before. This is a small village after all. Well, she's that Moabite woman who came back with Naomi. She's been gleaning here all morning. She's really a hard worker. So Boaz goes over and speaks to Ruth. You should stay in my fields. Don't go to the other farmers. You'll be safe here. If you need food or water, just take it from the stuff that my people have already brought out to the field. And Ruth is pretty amazed at this response from this farmer, this landowner. Why are you doing this favor for me, a foreigner? This is Boaz's reply. I've been told about you, about what you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. How you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you've done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. And so we meet Boaz, the other main character in this story. It turns out he's quite a gentleman. And he has been very impressed with the story of Ruth, even before he met her on this day in his field. Just as he has been generous regarding gleaning in his fields, so she has been generous in her care for her mother-in-law. And so he speaks a blessing upon her in Yahweh's name. He knows that she's made some significant life decisions, leaving her family, her homeland, to live with strangers, all for her mother-in-law. But he knows that she's also made a decision to come under the wings of the God of Israel, to take refuge here. Ruth, of course, is a bit overwhelmed by the attention from this man that she doesn't know. Boaz instructs his workers secretly to make sure that Ruth gets a bit more than you would normally expect from just gleaning, just picking up the leftovers. So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. So let's be clear. Ruth is not a princess, so to speak. She spent the day bent over on her hands and knees. Now, I've done that kind of work, picking tomatoes, picking strawberries, when I was struggling financially, going to college. It's hard work. She's collecting discarded grain stalks. And then she threshes it, that's another action there, leaving just the grains or the kernels of barley. It says this gave her 30 pounds of grain. That's an ephah. This gave her 30 pounds of grain. Just think about that for a moment. It says she picked that up and carried it home. Not a princess. Naomi is amazed at all this. Wow, like, how did you glean so much? Whose field were you working in? Well, this guy named Boaz, I think. He was really nice. Oh, the Lord bless him, Naomi says to her daughter-in-law. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. She added, that man is our close relative. He is one of our kinsman redeemers. Oh, God bless that man. He has not stopped showing chesed, that's the word, kindness to the living and the dead. I want you to look at that sentence for just a moment. Who is Naomi referring to? To Boaz or to Yahweh? If you just look at the English, and it's the same in the Hebrew, the he there could be referring to either Yahweh or Boaz, except who is it that has not stopped showing chesed? This is the first time we meet Boaz, but we've been following Yahweh for a while here. I wonder if the pieces are finally falling into place for Naomi. God never abandoned her family. It was they, in fact, who turned away from God. Further, Ruth, do you know that that man is a close relative? He's one of our kinsman redeemers. Ruth, he's what? And so we come to this other significant provision of God in this story, part of the backstory. It's another example of God's covenant faithfulness that's been built in from the beginning. The kinsman redeemer. In the law that was given at Sinai through Moses, that's where we find this kinsman redeemer, mostly recorded in the book of Leviticus. And it's there in Leviticus that God institutes the year of Jubilee. The whole discussion about Jubilee begins with God saying, the land is mine. I've invited you to live here and care for it so long as you keep my promises. This is your plot of land to farm and provide for your family. But if stuff happens and you might lose it through crop failures or bad management and have to sell it to someone, or you may end up as a kind of a feudal crop share servant to someone else who takes over your land. But after 49 years, in the 50th year, the year of Jubilee, everything reverts back to the original family who settled this land. So that the cycle of familial poverty is broken in God's plan every 2 generations. Just think about that. And you thought that those dry books there in the Leviticus and Deuteronomy and so forth, that they had nothing interesting in them. Actually, when you read it, you kind of get the impression that God was a socialist long before Karl Marx. So that's the background, the big picture. But what if in year 37 of that cycle, say, you can't make your farm work and you have to sell your property to a neighbor and you end up working for him in a kind of feudal slavery? Well, the law says that a relative who has the means is obliged to pay your debt and get you out of slavery and get your land back for you. That's a kinsman redeemer. This was the provision that God built into the law. Or try this one. What if the landholder dies and his wife and family are left not being able to provide for themselves? Well, the kinsman redeemer could help the woman until her sons grew to the age when they could manage the farm themselves. God built that provision into the law. But what if a husband and the sons die and the wife or the wives are left with no male to eventually take care of the land? Well, a kinsman redeemer, if he chose, could marry the woman and raise a son in her firstborn husband's name so that he could eventually inherit the land of his father. Little strange, but God built all these things into the covenant promise that he made with the people of Israel. So the next question is, did this kind of action, the kinsman redeemer, did that happen regularly in Israel? Did the system work? Well, no, not very often. Did they even keep the year of Jubilee? It's hard to say from the biblical record. There were so many things that the people did not do to honor the relationship they had with the God who brought them out of slavery in Egypt. But God's desire, his intention, and our inability to live up to expectations. Yeah, we keep falling short of what God was imagining. Our self-centered humanity always looks out for our own needs first. God's economy was built on ministering to the other ahead of ourselves. And so that's why socialism, probably most closely aligned with God's idea here, or capitalism, which is just to build your own wealth, or Keynesian liberalism, all of these economic systems always fall short. Because you got to work with selfish human beings in all cases. A broken down world. You'd almost think that the whole world needs a kinsman redeemer. And so we come to the end of chapter 2. Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It'll be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and the wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Ruth, this Boaz seems like a good guy. You need to stay working in his fields. Naomi knew that not everyone honored the Lord. Not everyone respected the covenant laws. She should know. She and her husband walked away from all the provisions of God because they were focused on their own selves, on their own struggles, not on the God who is long-suffering, faithful, the provider, the refuge, the one who rescues. It was at her lowest point that Naomi had begun to see Yahweh again for who he really was. So in closing, I just want us to reflect on God's covenant faithfulness. This is about God thinking way ahead of every need that his people might ever experience or imagine, while also recognizing this could all blow up because of our distorted self-centeredness. God made provision for the good and the bad. The gleaning laws, the kinsman redeemer are built in, expressing God's concern for the needy, the destitute, and the foreigner. Right there from the beginning. God made a promise. He made promises, and he's not stopped fulfilling his side of the bargain, so to speak. In our worship service live on Sunday, we'll gather around the Lord's table as we there again, in a sense, reflect on the kinsman redeemer who is thinking of us generously. In our service on Sunday, we're also going to sing that song, the hymn, "Great is Thy Faithfulness." You might want to just pause at the end of this and do a little search for "Great is Thy Faithfulness," to reflect on the character of God who from the beginning was always thinking ahead of us, his faithfulness, his promises. And what is our response to his faithfulness? The Lord be with you, friends. Have a good week. Take care.